Welcome back to our daily Bible study. I am Matthew Gage, pastor at Faith Baptist Church in Decatur, Texas, and we will be in Genesis chapter number 13 today. Genesis chapter number 13. And here we continue with the life of Abram, or Abraham as he will be known later. And I know I'm going to mess up and call him one or the other. His name is Abram right now. We'll get into the name, meaning, and all that when it changes. So forgive me if I do that, but here we are in the life of Abraham, and he's returning back from the mistake that he made in Egypt and going down to Egypt. And here in chapter number 13, his return, and we'll also see a mistake made by someone else, this time by his family, by Lot. And we'll look at that here in just a moment as we get into Genesis chapter number 13. So let's begin verse number 1. And Abram went up out of Egypt, he and his wife, and all that he had, and Lot with him into the south. Now, that south is talking about the southern part of Israel, to the south and west of the Dead Sea. And Abram was very rich in cattle, in silver, and in gold. That was verse number 2. Verse 3. And he went on his journeys from the south even to Bethel, unto the place where his tent had been at the beginning between Bethel and Hai, which is where he had come in, one of the places he originally camped we talked about last time. So he's returning to a place that he's been. In verse 4, it says, under the place of the altar that he had built there on his previous visit, which he had made there at the first, and there Abram called on the name of the Lord. So once again, we have Abram calling on God, praying to God, worshiping God, thanking God is an expression of his faith. So after he's returned from Egypt and probably thanking God that didn't go any worse, he's now back in the land, and once again thanking God for the promise and his protection, his provision, his providence, all those wonderful words we could throw in there. Verse number 5, we begin to see the mistake. And Lot also, which went with Abram, had flocks and herds and tents. And the land was not able to bear them, that they might dwell together, for their substance was great, so that they could not dwell together. So Abram is very rich, and then his nephew Lot is also very rich. And the size of their herds, now back then, I talked about having gold and silver and things, but wealth back then was more measured in, the size of your herds, the size of your flock. So having a great number of sheep or goats or cattle, that was more impressive than $1 million in the bank in that type of an economy. So with all these flocks, all these herds, all these servants working for them, there's just so much pasture land, so much grassland, so many watering holes and wells, and eventually there's going to be problem. There's going to be contention, and that's what we see in verse number 7. And there was a strife between the herdmen of Abram's cattle and the herdmen of Lot's cattle, and the Canaanite and the Perizzite dwelt then in the land. So now they're beginning to fight over pasture and water, and not only that, there's also enemies around there. So they're very limited in what they can do. So it's just not a good situation, very dangerous situation, because if Abram and Lot, if they're fighting each other, their enemies come in and take advantage of the situation and make raids and try to, steal things or break things, kill things, while they're distracted battling each other. So it's a dangerous situation that is developing here, and one that Abram is going to recognize and attempt to deal with. Verse 8. And Abram said unto Lot, let there be no strife, I pray thee, between me and thee, and between my herdmen and thy herdmen, for we be brethren. Is not the whole land before thee? Separate thyself, I pray thee, from me. If thou wilt take the left hand, then I will go to the right. If thou depart to the right hand, then I will go to the left. So Abram has a very easy deal. Says, okay, Lot, let's separate. You go your way, I'll go mine. You find the pastures you want, and whichever way you go to the left, I'll go right. You go right, I'll go left. I'll go the other way, but I will give you the first choice. Very big thing that Abram does here. Verse 10. And Lot lifted up his eyes and beheld all the plain of Jordan, that it was well watered, everywhere before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, even as the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, as thou comest unto Zoar. So what does Lot do? He looks out and he sees this land, the plains around the Jordan River, and just looks at the beauty of this land. It looks perfect. It's very lush, very green, comparing it to Eden or the well-watered plains there in Egypt. So looking at this as this is just the best place. I want that. It looks the best. So verse 11, then Lot chose him all the plain of Jordan, and Lot journeyed east, and they separated themselves the one from the other. Abram dwelled in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelled in the cities of the plain, and pitched his tent towards Sodom. Verse 13, but the men of Sodom were wicked and sinners before the Lord exceedingly. So in the decision that Lot makes, he makes a decision, really, you say, well, it makes sense, but it's a very fleshly decision. He sees what looks good for his own material well-being, but as he's going down that path, he's getting very dangerous in affecting his spiritual well-being. So he's going away from being around Abraham, a good influence, and now we see him drifting closer and closer and closer to the people of Sodom and, of course, Gomorrah, and we'll talk about that later. And this is going to end up ending very tragically for Lot and his family with the events that happen. And it all starts with the decision he makes on choosing that land for his flocks and his herds to graze. Verse number 14. And the Lord said unto Abram, after that Lot was separated from him, lift up now thine eyes, and look from the place where thou art northward and southward and eastward and westward. For all the land which thou seest, to thee will I give it, and to thy seed forever. So the promise here of the land, again, reiterating one of the promises he made in the previous chapter. He's saying, Abram, get up there and look out in all different ways. Now, I've been on some large mountains before. I've been up into the Rockies. I've been up in the Appalachian Hills and mountains. I've been in the hill country and down in South Texas. I've been in the Ozarks. I've been in some places with some pretty good sized hills and mountains and things. And you get up in those high elevations and you can see just dozens upon dozens upon dozens of miles. And this promise being made, Abram, look out there, and everything that you see, I'm going to give your descendants, give your children this land, and they will have it. Now, it does say that they will have it forever. Well, we know there's been times in history that they've been driven off, but they keep coming back, and then there's always been a Jewish presence there in some form, even after the Roman destruction of Judea and back in the 70 and then in the 130s AD until the establishment of the modern state of Israel in 1945, I believe it was, or was it 47, whatever it was. There even was a small Jewish presence, but now they have a state, and that's going to get back into even some prophetic implications when you get to the book of Revelation, where Israel is so important, that land is so important. And then we see the establishment of Christ's millennial kingdom, where there in Jerusalem, there in Israel. So those promises are very, very important here, and not just to Abram, not just to his descendants or the kingdom of Israel we read about in the Old Testament, but far-flung prophetic implications are here in this promise made to Abram. Verse 16. And I will make thy seed as the dust of the earth, so that if a man can number the dust of the earth, then shall thy seed also be numbered. So telling to the man whose wife is barren, saying one day your children, your descendants will be innumerable. You won't be able to count them. You might as well count the grains of sand on the seashore as count the number of descendants. And Abram, in faith, is believing God. He's waiting to see how that's going to happen. And it will be a number of years before that really gets going, but we'll revisit that. But God's going to stay true to that promise also. Verse 17. Arise, walk through the land in the length of it and in the breadth of it, and I will give it unto thee. Then Abram removed his tent and came and dwelt in the plain of Mamre, which is in Hebron, and built there an altar unto the Lord. So while Lot is there in place near Sodom and Gomorrah, or creeping ever closer to there, kind of in that the southern, or the up, kind of, I guess he starts kind of on the northern part of the Dead Sea, and then he's kind of slowly drifting around, looks like, to the southern side. Abram is more traveling around the Holy Land and kind of surveying the land that his children will one day possess. And kind of imagine him being there, looking out over a valley and thinking in his mind, one day there'll be a city there and it'll be my children. That city over there that the Jebusites have. Well, one day, my descendants are going to have that. And just the hope of the promise that Abram has is he's very much looking forward in faith to what God has promised him. So quite a bit of contrast here between Lot and Abram and their faith and where they're looking. Lot is looking at the material and the present, and Abram is looking at the future and the spiritual. And now we can look back, thousands of years later and see which of them chose the right path. And as this story develops, we'll see quite clearly that Abram chose wisely in following and obeying and trusting in the Lord. So, all right. Well, there we go. That wraps up chapter number 13 of the book of Genesis. I appreciate you watching. I hope it's been a help and a blessing to you.